Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of our first series, Climate Justice in West Asia, on the Ajyal Podcast. I'm your host, Rayan Qasim, Regional Director for Youth for Nature, and today we'll be discussing militarization and its effects on climate movements in Syria and Yemen. With me are our guests, Lama Ranjous. She's representing Syria, and she's the previous country coordinator for Syria at the Arab Youth Climate Movement. And she was also involved with the UN MGCY as a global focal point on migration. And our second guest, Mustafa, is representing Yemen, and he's a global ambassador at Youth for Nature, and he's also the Environment and Climate Change Program Coordinator at the International Youth Council in Yemen. So hello, hi, Lama and Ala. Thank you for being here today. We'll just shift to our first segment right now, which is a segment of quick questions with quick answers, and then we'll jump to our discussion. So let's start off with, I'll ask the question, Lama answers, and then Ala answers, and then we'll do it for every question. So number one, isolationism versus integrationism.
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 All right. Number two, is cultural social justice part of climate justice?
It should be.
Yes.
All right. Number three, is the international community responsible for the war happening in your country?
Partially.
Of course, yes.
Okay. And the last question is from 1 to 10. How much focus is given to the climate nowadays in your country?
2 to 3.
I can say 3.
Okay. Cool. Thank you so much. This was our first segment, quick questions, quick answers. And now let's initiate the discussion. Let's just sort of tell our audience that we're here to discuss how war, the lack of national security and political stability affects climate movements in Western Asia. We know that there's an ongoing war. It's been a few years in Yemen and in Syria, and we want to delve into youth priorities. And over here we have youth who are Ala and Lama, and we want to see how war and militarization has affected their youth priorities in their countries regarding the climate movement. So maybe I could start off with Lama, and then the second question we could shift to Ala. Lama, were you involved in the climate movement in your country prior to the war, and how has the war affected your progress? Sort of, maybe you could start to tell us, was there even a climate movement in Syria before the war, and was it affected? Did it grow stronger, or did it grow weaker? And how were you involved in this, and how did it affect you?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. So I would say yes, it was like very shy, tries to work on the climate change, but not really in a direct way. So before the war, my first job actually was with the local NGOs, and I worked as a member of a team called the Green Team, which focused to create a national learning and development. One of those learning activities was raising awareness about climate change. So that was like the main focus of the program, but one of the activities. So that before the war. And of course, after the war, I was more involved with the YCM, the Arab Youth Climate Movement. But in general, I moved to the humanitarian sector, and I focused more on that part. I tried my best to stay with the climate movement, doing those activities, but yeah, of course, it shifted. The focus shifted totally to humanitarian response.
Could I ask why? Why did that happen? Is it because there was international funding towards humanitarian issues rather than climate issues? Is that part of it?
Yeah, well, before the war and during the war, there was no really a good fund for climate change or environmental activity. It's not really that much. But after the war, yes, it was not a priority for people. So it was, I'm sorry to say that, but some people would say it's like silly. It's silly for me to discuss climate change, why people were dying from from the war itself. So I found it very challenging to keep working on that and trying to motivate people to pay attention to climate change and what's happening, while in the same time, like there is bombing and there is many reasons that actually cause death, um, direct death, not really death that we sometimes we'll discuss about the climate change and the impact of the climate change on the next generation. Yeah, but war was more like about how to live the moment and trying to survive without have been killed by other reasons.
Sort of now caring about the climate or climate justice, sort of a luxury for those not living in survival mode. Is this what you're
Yeah,
trying to say?
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Lama. Let's switch back to Ala. Ala, how did your priorities change during the war or militarization in Yemen? Does the stability affect how you perceive the environment? Do you care less about it because there is a war? How did it affect your priorities as a youth to protect the environment or to achieve climate justice?
So, Rayan, of course, stability affects how I perceive the environment. Because if stability is found in Yemen and the humanitarian situation gets better, then it will raise the awareness of the youth and the government about the environmental issues. We will find a space in which we share the environmental issues, and more importantly, the society can hear us. Because the war has increased the people's suffering in many aspects, such as the lack of water, draft, and food security, but still they don't know anything about the climate movement because of the war.
And was there awareness regarding the climate movement before the war?
No, actually, before the war, I don't know that there is anyone who advocates for the environment in Yemen, except for a number of two people that I know them personally. But during the war, this makes the youth in Yemen be involved in the political participation. But you cannot find anyone who is advocating for climate change or the environmental issues.
So still pretty basic in Yemen, even before the war, and now during the war, and as we might expect after the war. Let me ask you a follow-up question. So you both said that social justice is part of climate justice, and so we can achieve climate justice in your countries without achieving social justice. Could you, we'll ask Ala, and then we'll go back to Lama. Could you give us like some practical, solutions as to how, if we achieve social justice, we might achieve climate justice in Yemen, for example?
I didn't get your question, Ryan.
So we were discussing that one barrier to achieving climate justice is having social justice. So people having access to, public services, national security, all of these things. So if we achieve these things, then people might be able to focusing on the climate. Like, do you think that if we do that, like if we give people public services and national security, then we can shift to, or that people will have a better ability on focusing on climate justice?
Of course, Ryan, and that's what we are suffering here in Yemen. I'm working with a non-governmental organization. So the NGOs in Yemen are mainly focusing on humanitarian projects and to give people to improve their livelihood. So when we are talking about making projects about environmental education or to improve the climate situation in Yemen, people are telling you that you are talking about silly things. We don't need these things nowadays, because they are focusing mainly on basic things in Yemen. So they see the environment and climate change as a secondary issue that we will work on.
Okay. Um, Sort of to switch back to you, Lama, I know that it's like it might be the same in Syria, and so is there something we could do regarding, like the environment, sort of promoting nature-based solutions as a way for ecotourism, sort of to generate income within the sector? Do you think that like it would go hand in hand or in parallel with humanitarian projects?
Yeah, well, thank you for this question, Ryan, because I think also the humanitarian response should take into consideration the environmental aspect and climate change impact. So while programs are like implemented for a humanitarian response, they should have that like hand in hand, let's say, this part let's say like environmental sensitive programs as well. Unfortunately, until this moment, it's not that like they are not like this, or let's say the humanitarian response or more emergency response. Um, but luckily enough that now, for in some part of the Syria, they are like trying to start the recovery programs in some of let's say stable, relatively stable than other places in Syria. So they are like introducing these terms and introducing the SDGs, which I think it's really big step. So when you are talking about sustainable, sustainable development goals, you are talking also about like climate change. So I think that's a big step, and from that part, like I feel more uh, very positive about this introduction to SDGs and that how will impact the climate change movement in Syria.
Okay. Just to talk about the like the climate movement, I understand that it's pretty basic to, partially not existing in both countries. So the fear I wanted to ask, how does the climate movement in your countries differ to the climate movement in the West? Do you feel like there's a relation between the global climate movement or the climate movements in the Western countries, as to like the climate movements in your countries? Like is there a synergy between the two?
Well, I will talk about the Syria climate movement, which is part of the Arab climate movement. I think it's aligned with the international climate movement in general, but I don't think it should also have the same themes. For example, a priority for a country it should be showed on the climate movement in this country. We shouldn't be really talking about a priority for other like Western countries. We're still a developing country. We have our own priority. We have our own problems, and the impact of climate change will be really higher than the other countries. So, yeah, I think it should be aligned, but not having the same priority.
Just before to switch to Ala to answer that question, are you saying that the global climate movement is asking you to join them, as opposing that they join you? Is this what I'm trying to understand?
Yeah, like
Okay.
instead of the local movements in developing country joining the international movements, it should be the other way around.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Ala, what is your intake on that?
So you are talking about how we can replicate the global movement in Yemen.
No, not to replicate, but like, do you feel like there's a difference between the global climate movement and the climate movement in Yemen? Do you relate to the global one or not?
Of course, Rayan, in Yemen, we have a different situation. So when we want to advocate for the environment like the Western young people do, we will not have people interested in these topics, because in Yemen we have different culture than the Western culture. So people basically they are not educated to understand the basic things of the environment. When you talk to them about the environmental issues, you must give them an overview about the basics of the environment to understand the big issue of the climate change. So we still have so many things to do in Yemen, like changing the education system and making people interested in these things.
All right, so like I'm kind of noticing that there is a lack of climate awareness in both countries, and there is also a lack of funding support, and not just funding, but a movement support in both countries. So like three things in total. Let me just sort of switch to the sort of last question we have. We'll go to Lama and then we'll go back to Ala. What message of accountability do you have for the international community? And let me just explain that. We mentioned that, or you both mentioned that partially or completely that the international community is responsible for the war in your countries. So are they accountable for that? Because if they're not if they are accountable for that, then they're also accountable for the lack of movement in the climate action atmosphere in your country. So if you could answer that, and then if you could follow up with a question, how should youth support you in pushing for climate movements forward? So how can youth around the world, not just in the Western world, but globally, how can they support you? How can they support your climate movements in your country to be pushed forward? Yeah, let's start with Lama.
Okay, so for the first question, I would say it's very important for the international community to be accountable for what they are doing and what the opportunities that they offer. So what they are doing, basically, to hold accountable for their actions, what they missed. If there is a project, or there is like a programs that they are working on and they want to develop in my country, or they develop any other country, we should be aware of. We should be part of it. We should be partner with them in that sense. And the other thing is to be accountable for the opportunities that they are offered for youth, at least. Because I think, so for example, I will give an example, but it could like go for other also parties. Let's say for like any climate movement, international climate organization, let's say, working on a project in Syria. So I would like for the Syrian youth to be aware of that, what they are offering, or what the opportunity that the youth can work with this international organization. Because I think there is a lack of sharing this information with the all the stakeholders in general, and specifically the youth. So you can say maybe NGOs in Syria might have access to this information, but other stakeholders, they might not really have this access. So the target group is not really covering all the stakeholders in the Syrian community. The second question is what I want from the international youth.
Yeah.
To support the Syrian youth. I really for like first ask is to understand the differences in culture, in the impact of climate change, in all the aspect of life. It's really different, and if they understand that differences, they might also work on or to help in creating solutions or supporting youth in Syria to create solution, a solution that apply for Western countries might not really apply in Syria. So a bit of effort to understand the differences and what works and what not works on different countries, that will be really helpful.
Right, and sort of this is why we're doing these episodes, sort of to be able to bridge that knowledge gap in between youth in other countries and youth in our country, so that even if they want to support and want to learn, they need some basic knowledge, some discussions, some episodes like this. Yeah, I'll go back to you. Ala, would you like me to repeat the two questions, or you know them?
Yeah, please.
Okay, cool. So the first is, what message of accountability do you have for the international community? As we said, because they might be partially involved in these wars, and so how are they accountable? And number two, do you have any message to the youth around the world? How can they support youth in Yemen to support or to push climate movements forward?
Okay, so Ryan, regarding the international community, they are asked to, you know, that billions of dollars are spent in Yemen in the name of humanitarian projects and humanitarian relief, but we don't see any positive change in Yemen. The war is going, and nothing has changed until now. So we need developmental projects in Yemen that targets the educational system that can help us to build a generation that is able to build a better Yemen for the next generations. And regarding your second question, I think the international or the global youth can assist Yemen youth in educating them in the environmental issues. Because Riyan, in Yemen, not only youth that are not aware of environmental issues, but only people who are involved in the humanitarian work, or I talk about people who are educated. They don't know anything about climate change. So when we want to make a climate movement in Yemen, and we still have people who don't know anything about climate change, we can't achieve any result.
Okay, yeah, 100%. I agree. Sort of, there needs to be support regarding whether it's in awareness regarding climate change, but on a personal note, I prefer that the international community support that education through local NGOs in Yemen or in Syria, rather than having them come and educate people. Because as you both said, that there are local issues that only local people know. Sort of, these were my questions. Thank you so much for joining. I know that we can elaborate more. First and foremost, I hope that one day, very, very soon, all of these wars end, whether it's in Syria or in Yemen or in any other country in West Asia. Sort of, we could have peace, national security, political stability, so we can, push forward the climate movements. Because, as you both said, there's a lot of background information that is lacking, which is, awareness regarding climate change and climate movements before we initiate that climate movement that, we want to have. So thank you both so much. Thank you, Ala. Thank you, Lama, for joining me. And for our audience, thank you for listening. I hope that you've learned something. We'll have a conclusive webinar at the end of this series where you can come and join as an audience and ask Ala and Lama or anybody else, follow-up questions on these things, and let us know your opinion on these things. Do you both have any closing thoughts, any closing remarks, Ala and Lama?
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for nature. Sorry. For having us. I want to end on a positive note. Despite the war, the ongoing war in Syria, there is a really amazing initiatives run by youth in a different sectors, including environment. So there is a lot of positivity going on, and they are working on the ground despite all these challenges. I encourage people to search for these initiatives and learn more about them, and try to support those youth who are still in Syria and trying to work on the issue of climate change and environmental issues. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Lama.
Thank you, Rian. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to give you my opinions. And that's all.
Thank you both. Take care and see you all in our next episode. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.